Welcome to Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. I'm your host, Liddell Hastings, with technical support from Abel Amba. Today we are joined by Matthew Polacko to discuss the topic of the changing nature of class voting in Canada, 1965 to 2019. This article was also co-written by Simon Kiss and Peter Grafe. Insights by the CJPS can be found on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, and YouTube. To keep up to date on the CJPS podcast, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP. I'm joined today by Matt Polacko discussing the changing nature of class voting in Canada, 1965 to 2019. Matt, why don't you start by introducing yourself, a bit of your academic journey that brought you here, and kind of what brought you to the main topics of class voting and Canada.
Sure, great to talk to you today. I'm basically a postdoc now at the University of Quebec in Montreal, working with Alison Harrell. We're working on a SSHRC-funded project, multi-country project, looking at intergroup dynamics and the sources of social solidarity. And I also do some work as a postdoc collaborating with consortium on electoral democracy members, just involving projects with the Canadian election study. I started the postdoc back in October 2021, and after I finished my PhD at Royal Holloway in the UK. My PhD looked at the politics of income inequality through time series cross-sectional analysis from 1965 to 2019. I looked specifically at OECD countries in 4 empirical quantitative articles. The first 2 papers found that the policy offerings of political parties, looking on matters of redistribution, are a key mechanism moderating the negative effects of income inequality on voter turnout. I found this case at both the individual and the aggregate level. And then when looking closer at the individual level, I found that income inequality widens the turnout gap between the rich and the poor. This wasn't a new finding, but what was novel was my work into how lower income earners were then mobilized the most when there was more policy choices in the political system on redistribution, and then that reduced the gap between rich and poor, the negative effects of inequality. And then the final 2 papers of my PhD were more focused on the decline of social democracy and its relationship to income inequality. So there I looked at how I found that rightward economic movements of social democratic parties significantly reduced their vote share when inequality was higher. So basically the PhD kind of looked at that there was kind of gaps in the representation in the economic policy space in political systems. So my interest in class voting, which is what this paper is about, came kind of naturally from my PhD. There's a lot of overlap there. I'd also done my master's thesis on the effects of income inequality on voting in Canada, and so I've shifted much of my research back now to focusing on Canada. And this paper specifically came about from a SSHRC grant that my co-authors Simon Kiss, who's at Laurier, and Peter Grafe, who's at McMaster, they received that SSHRC grant a few years ago, and it basically involved recoding and merging the entire Canadian election study, basically to look at support for the NDP, with a particular focus on the different dimensions of social class. So it was really a shared interest in the evolution of the NDP that started this project and paper. And then once we started delving into the data, the idea about writing about class voting came about for this paper.
And what kind of gap or what addition is this paper adding to the literature of class voting or Canadian politics, either one?
Yeah, there's some big gaps in the Canadian literature. A lot of the attention has been focused on the changing class cleavage and class voting across the West, but that's kind of been neglected in Canada. Basically, the class voting is based on the premise that you vote for a political party based upon the class you're in. So workers would vote for a Social Democratic Party, and then managers would vote for a Conservative Party that suits their economic interests. And this tended to be the case in Europe, but not so much in Canada, researchers found. So I think this paper helps to fit the framework in the sense that, so another reason the kind of was weaker in Canada was because the NDP, our Social Democratic Party, was always kind of weak. They had never been in power at the federal level. So researchers tended to find that the linguistic differences in Canada, regional differences, and religious differences kind of trumped the effect of class on voting in Canada. So basically we wanted to, the recent work that came about on class voting was Bob Anderson's paper from about 10 years ago, and that was a long run analysis from 1965 on class voting in Canada. And we wanted to extend that because there's been quite a few changes in the party system since then. His went up to 2004. And since then, there was a merger on the right there in the party system, and there's been 7 elections since then that have occurred. And also the theoretical expectation that the working class will support social democratic parties has kind of changed, because we're seeing a lot in Europe now that the working class is moving more to the right and voting more for the far right and conservative parties. So we wanted to also see if this was the case in Canada, and if there is a class voting that's occurring, because Canada has kind of a weak nativist cleavage, so there's a chance that this is not even really there. It's one of the reasons it's kind of ignored before as well.
So kind of building off of that, what was the biggest surprise you had based on your initial theories going in, or hypotheses or predictions, and kind of where the data took you as you built out this time series?
I think probably a couple things were surprising. We were surprised by how much the working class has moved away from the liberals over time. We're aware, as many are, that the liberals are kind of geared towards aiming for the middle class. You can really see this since Trudeau came into power. His tax cut when he got in was targeted to the middle class, and then the following election he brought in that Ministry of Middle Class Prosperity that was short-lived. So then this kind of speaks to the character of the Liberal Party in terms of being like catch-all, very amorphous party. So I think this focus on the middle class has probably caused some working class votes that we see in our paper, that they tended to move towards the Conservatives in recent years. So that was one big surprise. And then I think another one had to do with the big shift we saw specifically just in the 2019 election. Our paper goes up to 2019. And there we did find a weak but noticeable class cleavage outside of Quebec of working class voting for the NDP. And then this was been accompanied by a gradual shift from towards the Conservatives of the working class over time. And then this seemed to be a historic shift in 2019, where the coefficient effect size basically doubles in size from the previous election. And we're not fully sure what really accounts for that accelerated trend in 2019, but it would be really interesting to see when, if we can, or other people look into 2021 and see if that is still the case, or maybe it was just a bit of a one-off in that election, and maybe it's gone back down to the natural trend. But yeah, that'll be really interesting to investigate further.
What are some of the broad, in a kind of comparative sense, reasons working class votes have been kind of shedding off towards the right conservative parties like what kind of causal mechanisms do you see? And then specifically, do you think those mechanisms are the same for Canada, or are there unique mechanisms working in the Canadian context?
I think the Canadian context does align with what is happening elsewhere, because we see there's been an emergence in the past generation or so, dating back to the 80s or 90s probably, that there's been more of an emphasis on the second dimension and cultural issues. The so-called libertarian, authoritarian dimension that kind of plays out over conflicts over immigration, more traditional values. And then so I think that this has led to changes where the working class, which has always been more conservative, a bit more authoritarian in their outlook than the other classes, this leads to cross pressures there. So they're not always going to vote with their economic interests in this case. And I think there's a bit of a breakdown there. And then they are more likely to move to the right. You can see that in the election of Donald Trump and Brexit. And then we see across Europe there's been an increase in the far right voting. So I think we still see this happening in Canada, obviously to a lesser degree. There's the constraints in Canada of the party system we have. The majoritarian system really limits the emergence of a far right party. Although we have seen it now with the Populist Party. They got 5% in the last election, and they're polling around that now. They really focus on immigration issues and nativism. So I think they're drawing from the working class. So there is an emergence there. It's just due to strategic voting and the party system that they haven't been able to break out there, and these votes often end up with the Conservatives. But you can see with the rhetoric of the new leader Poliev, and then the last one, O'Toole, that they're really targeting the working class there. It seems to be their goal of one of their main avenues to get into power is to get more support from the working class there. So I think these trends definitely are happening in Canada as well.
Nice. I'm going to quickly transition a little bit into how the measurement of class. And you can correct me wrong but in your paper, the main measurement of class was profession, grouped into categories mainly. And in terms of identifying by class, there's the materialist perspective, which might be your job or your material well-being, and then there's the more of a cultural element to class as well. What was your decision to go with profession over, let's say, something like income? And after doing this time series, what are some things you might like to see in surveys moving forward that makes class measurement easier or maybe more effective or captures it in a maybe more nuanced or complicated way?
Mm-hmm. Sure. This is a good question. I think our definition, we decided to base it on the kind of classic One Erickson and Goldderp's famous schema that's based on hierarchy and tasks. So we classed occupations based on professionals, managers, the routine non-manual, and the working class. And then there's a fifth one, self-employed, which we included. But there's a big choice to separate between the routine non-manual and then the manual. So like lorry drivers, things like that, truck drivers, and the routine non-manual is more lower paying service ones where you deal with cashiers, things like that. So we decided to separate that and have the working class just focused on the manual one for our paper. I think that has some benefits because there's different outlooks that you can have based on your class occupation there. We don't want to say which class is the real working class, but we're open to the possibility that This can give you a different outlook based on your specific occupation there. And then we also wanted to align with Anderson's paper from 10 years ago, and this was a scheme that he used. So we wanted to be consistent to that and to be able to replicate what he did. And then there's also the union is much more concentrated in the manual working class, and that's been one of the key links in Canada over time, where there has been a bit of class voting there, has been shown through the union rather than occupation we've seen from previous work. So I think that those are the main reasons for what we decided to go with the occupations there. I think. Sorry, what was the second part of your question there?
I guess in what ways, and I can add a bit to the second part, in what ways do you think, in terms of surveys like the Canadian election study or comparable surveys, can do to help better measure class moving forward? And like even example of asking self-identifying with class. I don't believe there's a question like that in any of the CSs, Canadian election studies. Do you see value in asking people themselves what the class they identify as, or do you think more objective measures like profession or income are more helpful for work like this?
Yeah, for sure. We were quite hampered in the CES about what we could use to measure class, because it changed quite a bit over time. The different teams had different measures there. There were some subjective measures that I think were really useful, where you think you fit in the class, middle class, upper class, or lower class. But that was only kind of offered in the 70s and 80s, sporadically. And since there's only been the occupation one that we could really use for that. So I think going forward, obviously, it would be great if there was more concentration on that. We got income is obviously in there, and education levels has been for a long time. I think going forward, it would be great if we took more on board the gold standard of like the European Social Survey, which has tons of class-related variables. The British election study as well. It would be good to have all those. But I know they're under a lot of funding constraints. Specifically, the Canadian election study team. It's difficult to make choices what you can include in there going forward, especially. So we have to make do with what we have there.
Yeah, I'm just thinking because I've done a little bit of research on self-identifying class, and what I can find is the numbers in Canada are much lower than even compared to the States, or UK is our closest comparable. So it would be interesting if there was some more data there on self-identifying class in terms of in a comparative perspective. But that's also my own, for my own personal well-being in terms of research. Okay, let's move into maybe a bit more of the speculative questions. So the NDP, part of the paper is talking about how, they had a large working class segment within their supporter base, but that it's persisted, but it's maybe waned a little bit in the last few elections. Correct me if I'm wrong there. So moving forward, I mean, the Liberals have been losing it since 1993. But what can the NDP do in kind of this era where working class people are moving towards the right? What can they do to kind of maintain voters? You talk about a bit in the paper, what strategies they could take moving forward.
Sure. That's for the NDP specifically. Yeah, we also kind of look at this in a new paper that that's been invited to resubmit at an international journal as well. We're looking kind of at the education and income cleavages more specifically this time in Canada over time, and then we do the implications of that for redistribution. So you can look forward to that. But I think for this, we also, in terms of redistribution, there's definitely a big focus that the NDP, I think, probably needs to have. So we kind of show that the NDP is doing increasingly well with lower income voters, and they tend to be more pro redistribution. So I think it would benefit the NDP to try to really corner this base with appeals to redistribution, to kind of get at that cross-cutting that is occurring for the working class and lower income people, where a lot are moving to the conservatives, even though they might be pro-distribution. Especially in recent years with the cost of living crisis, I think these issues are more salient now, redistribution. So, and I think also it would be good because, as you mentioned, the NDP is starting to lose more votes, union members over to the conservatives. So they should really try to win back these voters, and I think a good way of doing that is to obviously through more distribution, economically leftist policies, but also try to focus more on strengthening labor. The labor movements and labor laws would be a good way to make more inroads with the union sector. I think the NDP also, they really missed a golden chance in the 2015 election there. That was their opportunity where they were in a three-way battle there, and they were just before the election really close to power, but they were allowed themselves to get outflanked by the Liberals on the left. So I think they need to make sure they don't make that mistake again, especially because it seems like the Trudeau government is starting to run on some of its last legs there. It's been in power a long time now, and it's dipped a little bit in the polls, so I think they're a bit vulnerable. And the NDP needs to be kind of careful not to be dragged down by the Liberals through their confidence supply agreement that they've had now for I guess a year now, especially if the deal continues to not really yield much substantial policy change there. So I think those are some of the main things that the NDP should focus on going forward.
Yeah, speaking to that union membership, do you find, I don't know how closely you follow Ontario politics, but in Ford's most recent win, it looked like some of the union support kind of went towards him. Traditional union voters that would have been with the NDP for a long time. Do you see that as a kind of canary in the coal mine for union voting going forward, or was that more charisma Ford seems to have in Ontario and more of an Ontario specific phenomenon?
Yeah, I think it could definitely be one. I think he did do quite well with the unions, more so than in the past, but it tended to be more private sector ones. I know he's doing some of those. He didn't really make many inroads with the public sector ones. So that would be a big leap if they were able to do that, which I don't really see happening. So I think that is a wider trend, though, that we're seeing, where the Conservatives are making more inroads there amongst the union members across Canada.
Great. All right. We're going to just wrap up now. I'm going to give an option to kind of, if you want to self-promote, you mentioned some research you're working on already. If there's anything you want to plug before we wrap up. Other than that, I'm done for questions.
Sure. I'm working on a few projects now. As I mentioned, I'm kind of continuing the research in this realm of class voting. Got a couple of papers with Simon and Peter, kind of extensions of this. Another one, we're looking at economic precarity and its effects on voting for the right in Canada, kind of moderated by immigration, to see if that's the window that it's happening in. And I'm also kind of continuing some of the research from my PhD, looking at social democracy and income inequality, and then those effects on voting. But I'm kind of trying to gear more towards Canada now. I've kind of shifted more to focusing on the Canadian research now. And another topic I'm looking at is delving kind of into satisfaction with democracy. especially among young people, and its relationship with how people were doing economically, their perceptions of the economy, to see if there's how healthy democracy is basically in Canada in those aspects. I think those are the main things I'm focusing on lately.
Okay, great. And thank you for coming on the podcast, and best of luck with those research projects moving forward. And maybe we'll have you back on regarding one of those in the future.
Great. Thanks so much for having me on here.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Insights, a Canadian Journal of Political Science podcast. This was Matthew Polacko discussing the topic of the changing nature of class voting in Canada, 1965 to 2019. For future episodes, follow us on Twitter at CJPS_RCSP or subscribe to us on Spotify, Apple Podcasts, or YouTube. If you want to support the CJPS and this podcast, we welcome any distribution of our episodes and further reading of the articles discussed. We hope Insights by the CJPS will be a valuable resource for teaching political science and will inspire you to read the full article.